What if the foods most people walk past every single day once meant the difference between life and death, and the people who understood them best lived thousands of years ago? Long before supplements, detox trends, and overpriced wellness hacks, ancient civilizations were eating foods the Bible mentions again and again, not just as meals, but as medicine. And now, modern science is uncovering something almost unbelievable. Many of those same foods are packed with compounds that fight inflammation, protect the heart, support the brain, and even help the body battle disease at the cellular level. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Some of these foods were so prized they were treated like treasure. Some were used to cleanse wounds, restore strength, and carry people through famine, war, and the wilderness. And some sound so ordinary today, you'd never guess they once held near miraculous status. By the time we get to the end of this list, you'll see why one ancient herb used in purification rituals is now being studied for its germ-killing power, why one overlooked wilderness food may have been far more powerful than anyone realized, and why so much of what passes for healthy today is a watered-down imitation of what people were actually eating back then. So if you think the Bible only talks about food in a symbolic way, think again. Because these weren't just sacred ingredients. They were survival tools, healing weapons, and in some cases, the closest thing the ancient world had to medicine. And once you see what science is finally confirming, you may never look at your grocery list the same way again. Before pharmacies, before prescriptions, before anyone even understood what a vitamin was, people were still healing. Not slowly. Not accidentally. But consistently. Because in the ancient world, food wasn't just something you ate to survive. It was something you used to treat wounds, fight illness, restore strength, and protect the body from breaking down in the first place. There were no shelves lined with pills, but there was something far more powerful hiding in plain sight, everyday ingredients that doubled as medicine. Olive oil wasn't just poured over meals, it was rubbed into injuries. Honey wasn't just sweet, it was used to stop infection. Herbs weren't just for flavor, they were used to cleanse, detox, and heal from the inside out. And the most fascinating part? These weren't random traditions. They were repeated, recorded, and passed down for generations because they worked. Fast forward to today, and we've done something strange. We separated food from healing. We turned nutrition into calories, macros, and trends, while quietly forgetting that some of the most powerful health tools were sitting in kitchens all along. And now, thousands of years later, science is starting to catch up, confirming that many of these ancient foods contain compounds that act like natural anti-inflammatories, antimicrobials, and even protective agents against chronic disease. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The very first item on this list wasn't just food, and it wasn't just medicine. It was considered sacred. It was used on kings, on the sick, and even in moments of life and death. And what modern research has discovered about it changes everything. It was poured over kings before they took the throne, pressed into wounds when someone was bleeding, and used daily in homes across the ancient world like it was as essential as water. Olive oil wasn't just important, it was everywhere. In fact, it's mentioned over 100 times in ancient scripture, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Food, fuel, medicine, even a symbol of blessing. But here's what's wild. The people using it back then had no idea they were working with something that modern science would later compare to actual pharmaceutical drugs. Because when researchers finally broke down what's inside real, high-quality olive oil, they found a compound called oleocanthal, and it behaves almost identically to ibuprofen in the body. Same anti-inflammatory pathways. Same pain-reducing effects. Except this wasn't synthesized in a lab, it was pressed straight from a fruit. And that changes how you look at everything. Because inflammation is at the root of almost every major health issue today, heart disease, joint pain, cognitive decline, and the ancient world was unknowingly fighting it every single day with something they poured over their food without thinking twice. But here's the part most people miss. What they were using back then is not what most people are buying today. Ancient olive oil was cold-pressed, unfiltered, and fresh. It wasn't stripped, diluted, or heat-processed. It was alive, packed with antioxidants, healthy fats, and compounds your body immediately recognized and used. Today, a huge percentage of store-bought olive oil is either degraded or mixed with cheaper oils, meaning you're not getting the same effect, not even close. And suddenly, it makes sense why something so simple had such a powerful reputation. Because in its real form, olive oil wasn't just food. It was daily medicine hiding in plain sight. But as powerful as that is, the next one might be even more shocking. Because this wasn't just used for healing, it literally never expires, and can destroy bacteria that modern antibiotics struggle to kill. It's one of the only foods on Earth that can sit untouched for thousands of years, and still be perfectly edible. No mold. No spoilage. No expiration date. Archaeologists have literally opened ancient tombs and found jars of honey that were over 3,000 years old, and still safe to eat. That alone sounds unreal, but what's even more shocking is what happens when honey touches the human body. Because raw honey doesn't just preserve itself. It actively destroys bacteria. Modern studies have shown that certain types of honey can kill some of the toughest, most antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, including ones hospitals struggle to control. And it does it in a way that's almost hard to believe. When honey comes into contact with moisture, like a wound or your throat, it slowly produces hydrogen peroxide, the same compound used to disinfect cuts. But that's just one part of it. It also has a naturally low pH that bacteria can't survive in, plus a unique protein that literally attacks and breaks them down. That's why today, in some hospitals, medical-grade honey is used in wound dressings to speed up healing and prevent infection. Now think about that for a second. Thousands of years ago, people were applying this directly to wounds, sore throats, and infections, without ever knowing the science behind it. They just knew it worked. But here's where most people get it completely wrong today. The honey sitting on most grocery store shelves. It's not the same. The moment honey is heavily processed or heated, many of those powerful enzymes and compounds start to break down. What you're left with is something that tastes similar, but doesn't behave the same way in the body. Ancient honey was raw, unfiltered, straight from the hive, alive with everything that made it medicinal. And that's why it was seen as more than just food. It was strength. It was energy. It was healing. A single spoonful could sharpen focus, soothe the body, and protect against infection, all at once. But as powerful as honey is, the next group of foods takes things in a completely different direction. Because these weren't just eaten for health. In one case, they were used to treat a king on the edge of death, and what happened next still raises eyebrows today. One of the most overlooked details in ancient texts sounds almost too strange to be real. A dying king, a life-threatening infection, and the treatment. Figs. Not a rare herb. Not a secret potion. Just a simple fruit, crushed and applied directly to the wound. And according to the account, he recovered. For centuries, that sounded symbolic, maybe even primitive. Until science stepped in. Because figs contain natural enzymes that break down damaged tissue and help the skin regenerate. They also carry antimicrobial compounds that fight off infection at the source. What looked like a basic remedy was actually doing something very real inside the body. And that's when you start to realize, these fruits weren't chosen randomly. They were used because they worked. Take dates, for example. In the ancient world, if you were crossing the desert, fighting in battle, or surviving long journeys, dates could keep you alive. They're packed with natural sugars that hit your bloodstream fast, but unlike refined sugar, they come bundled with fiber, minerals, and antioxidants that keep your energy stable instead of crashing. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Modern studies have found that women who eat dates in the final weeks of pregnancy often experience shorter and smoother labor. Something ancient cultures practiced instinctively, now backed by clinical research. It's like they knew something we forgot. Then there's the pomegranate, a fruit so valued it was carved into temples and woven into symbolism across entire civilizations. But behind that beauty is something far more powerful. Pomegranates contain rare compounds that break down into molecules linked to reduced inflammation, improved heart health, and even protective effects against certain diseases. In fact, their antioxidant levels are so high, they outperform many of the superfoods people obsess over today. And here's the pattern you start to see. These weren't just fruits people ate for taste. They were tools. For survival. For healing. For endurance. Simple on the outside, but incredibly complex on the inside. Which makes what comes next even more surprising. Because the next foods on this list weren't reserved for kings or rituals. They were eaten by the poorest people alive, and somehow, they may have been even more powerful. They weren't served in palaces. They weren't considered luxurious. And no one bragged about eating them. But they kept entire civilizations alive. Lentils, barley, and ancient forms of wheat were the foods of the poor, the everyday staples that fueled workers, soldiers, and families who had nothing else. And yet, when researchers look at the diets of the longest living populations in history, these exact foods show up again and again. Not occasionally. Daily. Start with lentils. There's a reason they were traded, valued, and depended on for survival. Lentils are packed with plant protein, iron, and fiber, but what makes them truly powerful is how slowly they release energy. No spikes. No crashes. Just steady fuel that keeps the body going for hours. Modern studies now link regular lentil consumption to improved heart health, stable blood sugar, and even longer lifespan. In other words, the poor man's food may have been one of the smartest dietary choices anyone could make. Then there's barley. Not flashy. Not trendy. But quietly one of the most gut-friendly grains ever studied. Barley is loaded with a type of fiber called beta-glucan, which forms a gel-like substance in your digestive system. That might sound strange, but here's what it does. It slows sugar absorption, lowers cholesterol, feeds beneficial gut bacteria, and supports immune function all at once. Even today, health authorities recognize its impact, but back then, people were eating it simply because it was available, unaware they were protecting their bodies in the process. And then comes the biggest shift of all. Wheat. Because when ancient texts talk about bread, they're not talking about what most people are eating today. Ancient wheat, varieties like einkorn and emmer, were completely different from modern wheat. Fewer chromosomes. Different gluten structure. Higher levels of nutrients and antioxidants. And for many people, far easier to digest. Modern wheat, on the other hand, was engineered for yield and mass production, not for how the human body responds to it. And that one change may explain why so many people today feel bloated, sluggish, or sensitive after eating foods that were once dietary staples. So suddenly, the picture becomes clearer. It wasn't the grains themselves that changed. It was what we did to them. And while the poorest people in the ancient world relied on these foods to survive, and often thrive, we replaced them with faster, more processed versions, and lost something important in the process. But now the story takes a turn. Because the next foods on this list weren't just about survival. They were controversial, powerful, and when used the wrong way, could do more harm than good. This is where things get a little complicated. Because not every ancient superfood was blindly praised. Some came with warnings. Boundaries. Even consequences if used the wrong way. And nothing represents that tension better than wine. In ancient texts, wine shows up in two completely different lights. On one hand, it's used in celebration, ritual, even healing. On the other, it's tied to excess, poor judgment, and downfall. Which raises a question most people never stop to ask. Was wine actually healthy, or was it dangerous? The answer is, both. Because in the ancient world, wine wasn't consumed the way it is today. It was diluted, taken in small amounts, and almost always paired with food. It wasn't about escape or indulgence, it was about function. In fact, it was often used medicinally. There are records of wine being applied to wounds as a disinfectant, and even consumed in small amounts to support digestion and protect against contaminated water. And when modern researchers started studying it, they found something surprising. Red wine contains powerful compounds like resveratrol and polyphenol, substances linked to improved heart health, reduced inflammation, and even cellular repair. Some studies suggest moderate consumption may support longevity and protect against certain chronic conditions. But here's the key word: moderate. Because the moment that balance is lost, the benefits disappear, and the damage begins. And that's exactly why ancient teachings treated wine with caution. Not because it was inherently bad, but because it was powerful. Now compare that to grapes, the source of it all. Grapes don't come with the same warning label. They show up again and again as symbols of life, growth, and abundance. But beyond symbolism, they're packed with many of the same beneficial compounds found in wine, without the risk. Resveratrol, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory agents, all concentrated in the skin and seeds. And when consumed whole, grapes also deliver fiber, vitamins, and hydration that wine simply doesn't. In other words, grapes give you the benefits, without the downside. And that contrast reveals something deeper. The ancient world didn't just care about what you consumed, they cared about how you consumed it. Context mattered. Balance mattered. Intent mattered. Which is a perspective that feels almost lost today. But what comes next shifts the focus completely. Because the next foods weren't controversial. They were foundational, the kind of foods that quietly built strong bodies, sharp minds, and resilient systems from the inside out. Long before protein powders, brain supplements, or gut health trends, there were two foods quietly doing all the heavy lifting. No hype. No branding. Just results. Fish and milk, not in the form we know today, but in their raw, natural, unprocessed state, were the foundation of daily life. And what's incredible is how closely modern science now links these exact foods to some of the most critical functions in the human body. Start with fish. In the ancient world, especially around coastal regions and places like the Sea of Galilee, fish wasn't occasional, it was constant. It was one of the primary sources of nourishment, simple, accessible, and incredibly effective. But here's what no one back then could explain. Fish is one of the richest sources of omega-3 fatty acids on the planet, specifically EPA and DHA, nutrients your body cannot produce on its own. These fats are literally built into your brain cells. They support memory, focus, mood, and protect against cognitive decline. And that's just the beginning. Omega-3s are also deeply anti-inflammatory, meaning they help calm the same internal processes that drive heart disease, joint pain, and chronic illness. Study after study shows that populations who eat fish regularly tend to live longer, think clearer, and suffer less from the diseases that dominate modern life. So while today people are buying capsules trying to optimize their brain, ancient communities were just eating fish. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The way they prepared it mattered. No deep frying. No processed oils. Just simple cooking, often grilled or dried, which preserved the nutrients instead of destroying them. The benefit wasn't just in the food, it was in the simplicity. And then there's milk. But not the kind you're probably thinking of. When ancient texts describe a land flowing with milk and honey, they're not talking about heavily processed, factory-produced dairy. They're talking about goat's milk, a completely different substance when it comes to how the body handles it. Goat milk has a different protein structure, smaller fat particles, and is naturally easier to digest. And here's the part most people overlook. In its traditional form, it wasn't just milk, it was alive. Fresh, fermented, turned into yogurt or kefir, it was full of beneficial bacteria that supported the gut. Long before anyone used the word microbiome, people were regularly consuming foods that strengthened it. Which means, without realizing it, they were building a stronger immune system, from the inside out. And when you step back, you start to see the pattern again. These weren't specialty foods. They were everyday essentials. The kind of foods people didn't think twice about, yet they quietly supported the brain, the gut, the heart, the entire system. But the next section flips everything on its head. Because it's not about major foods anymore. It's about something much smaller, something most people would overlook, yet it may have been one of the most powerful healing tools they had. They weren't the main part of the meal. They didn't fill you up. They didn't look impressive. And most people today would treat them as nothing more than flavor. But in the ancient world, these small, overlooked plants may have carried some of the most powerful healing properties of all. Because herbs and spices weren't just added for taste. They were used with intention. Take hyssop. For a long time, people assumed it was purely symbolic, something tied to rituals, cleansing ceremonies, spiritual meaning. But when researchers started analyzing it, they found something unexpected. Hyssop contains compounds like thymol and carvacrol, the same powerful antimicrobial agents found in oregano. These substances don't just sit in the body, they actively fight bacteria, viruses, and fungi. So when ancient people used hyssop for cleansing, they weren't just performing a ritual. They were applying a natural disinfectant. And suddenly, what seemed symbolic starts to look practical. Then there's cumin. A tiny seed, but incredibly potent. It was so valued that people carefully measured and even tithed it, which tells you everything about how important it was. And modern science backs that up in a big way. Cumin supports digestion by stimulating enzyme production, helps regulate blood sugar levels, and even shows antimicrobial effects. It's also packed with iron, something many people today are unknowingly deficient in. In other words, this wasn't just seasoning. It was daily support for the body's core systems. And then comes coriander. At first glance, it's just another spice. But dig a little deeper, and it gets interesting fast. Coriander has been linked to reduced anxiety, anti-inflammatory effects, and even the ability to help the body process and remove certain heavy metals. It also soothes the digestive system, reducing bloating and discomfort after meals. Which explains why it kept showing up in ancient diets again and again. Not because it was trendy, but because people felt the difference when they used it. And that's the pattern you can't ignore. These weren't rare or complicated substances. They were small, accessible, easy to overlook. But when used consistently, they worked quietly in the background, protecting the body, supporting digestion, fighting off infection, all without drawing attention to themselves. It's almost like the most powerful tools weren't the ones people noticed the most. And that idea becomes even clearer in the next section. Because the foods people missed the most, the ones they actually cried over losing, might be some of the most powerful of all. It's one of the strangest moments recorded in ancient history. A group of people, freed from slavery, traveling towards something better, suddenly break down and start complaining. Not about danger. Not about the journey. About food. Specifically, garlic and onions. They remembered them. Craved them. Even said they missed them so much it made everything else feel empty. And at first, that sounds almost ridiculous, until you understand what those foods were actually doing inside their bodies. Because garlic isn't just strong in flavor. It's one of the most powerful natural defense systems you can eat. The moment you crush or chop garlic, it releases a compound called allicin, and this stuff is aggressive. It doesn't just sit there, it actively fights bacteria, viruses, fungi, and even certain parasites. It's been studied for its ability to support the immune system, reduce blood pressure, improve heart health, and even shorten the duration of illness. In simple terms, garlic helps your body fight back. And in a world without medicine, that wasn't a bonus, it was essential. which suddenly makes their craving make a lot more sense. They weren't just missing the taste. They were missing how it made them feel. And right next to garlic were onions. Less intense, maybe, but just as important. Onions are loaded with compounds that reduce inflammation and support the body's natural detox systems. But what really sets them apart is something most people don't think about at all. They feed your gut. Onions are rich in prebiotic fibers, the kind that nourish beneficial bacteria in your digestive system. And those bacteria don't just help you digest food, they influence your immune system, your energy levels, even your mood. So when you eat onions regularly, you're not just feeding yourself. You're feeding an entire ecosystem inside your body that keeps everything running smoothly. Now imagine suddenly losing that. No garlic. No onions. No daily support for your immune system or gut health. Of course they noticed. Of course they craved it. Because these weren't just ingredients. They were part of what kept people strong, resilient, and functioning. And that realization leads to something even more surprising. Because the next foods on this list weren't associated with struggle or survival. They were seen as valuable enough to be offered as gifts, the kind of foods you brought to impress kings. These weren't everyday snacks tossed into a bag or eaten without thinking. They were gifts. Carefully chosen. Rare. Valuable enough to be presented to rulers, and meaningful enough to symbolize abundance and favor. When someone wanted to make an impression, to show respect, wealth, or gratitude, they didn't bring just anything. They brought almonds and pistachios. And that tells you everything. Because in the ancient world, value wasn't assigned randomly. If something was rare, it had to earn that status. It had to nourish, sustain, or provide something others couldn't. And modern science shows, these nuts absolutely do. Start with almonds. Small, simple, easy to overlook. But nutritionally, they're one of the most dense foods you can eat. They're loaded with vitamin E, a powerful antioxidant that protects your cells from damage. They're rich in magnesium, which supports hundreds of processes in the body, including muscle function, nerve signaling, and energy production. And they provide healthy fats that support heart health and keep you feeling full longer. But here's something most people don't realize. Not all the calories in almonds are actually absorbed. Because of their structure, some of the fat passes through the body and instead feeds beneficial gut bacteria. So you're getting nourishment, satiety, and gut support, all at once. Which explains why they were more than just food. They were efficient fuel. And then there are pistachios. Slightly sweeter. More vibrant. And just as powerful in a completely different way. Pistachios are rich in compounds that support eye health, particularly lutein and zeaxanthin, which help protect vision over time. They're also packed with potassium, supporting healthy blood pressure, and contain a surprisingly strong balance of amino acids for a plant-based food. But what really stands out is what they do for the gut. Studies have shown that pistachios can significantly increase beneficial gut bacteria, even more than many other nuts. And just like we saw before, that directly impacts digestion, immunity, and overall health. So once again, something that looked like a luxury was actually functional. These weren't empty indulgences. They were foods that supported the body in quiet but powerful ways, the kind of foods you'd want to give someone important, because they actually mattered. And that brings us to the final piece of this entire story. Because the last food on this list wasn't a luxury, and it wasn't common either. It was something completely different. Something tied to survival, to isolation, to the wilderness itself. And what it reveals might change how you think about food entirely. Out in the wilderness, far from cities, far from trade, far from comfort. And yet, there was one man who survived out there for years, not just surviving, but enduring, functioning, continuing his mission day after day. And according to ancient accounts, his diet was shockingly simple. Wild honey, and something referred to as locusts. Now for a long time, people assumed that meant insects. And maybe it did. But many historians and scholars believe something else entirely, that this was actually referring to the pods of the carob tree, often called locust beans. And once you understand what carob is, that idea starts to make a lot more sense. Because carob is unlike almost anything else. At first glance, it looks unremarkable. A dry, brown pod hanging from a tree in harsh, unforgiving environments. But inside, it's packed with natural sugars for energy, an incredibly high amount of fiber for digestion, and a surprising range of minerals that support the body under stress. In other words, it's built for survival. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Carob has been used historically to treat digestive issues, both extremes. It can help slow things down when the body is losing too much, and stabilize things when digestion is off balance. Modern studies have even looked at its effects against certain gut infections, showing real antimicrobial activity. So now imagine this combination. Carob for sustained energy, gut stability, and nutrients. Honey for quick energy, antimicrobial protection, and healing support. Together, they form something incredibly rare, a simple, natural system that fuels the body, protects it, and keeps it functioning, even in the harshest conditions. Which completely flips the original assumption. Because if that's what he was actually eating, he wasn't barely getting by. He was operating on one of the most efficient, functional diets possible with what was available. And that's the moment everything clicks. Because across this entire list, from olive oil to honey, from lentils to herbs, from nuts to wilderness food, the pattern never changed. The most powerful foods weren't the most complex. They weren't engineered. They weren't processed. They weren't packaged. They were simple. Observed. Used. Passed down. And they worked. Which leaves you with one final question. If people thousands of years ago were able to build their health, their strength, and their resilience on foods like these, why did we ever stop? For thousands of years, people didn't have labs, nutrition labels, or health influencers telling them what to eat. They had observation. They paid attention to what gave them strength, what healed wounds, what kept them alive through famine, disease, and harsh environments. And over time, those patterns became tradition. Not guesses, proven, repeated results. And now, in a world flooded with options, trends, and processed substitutes, we've somehow drifted away from that simplicity. We chase complicated solutions, while ignoring the basics that worked for generations. Because here's the truth that's hard to ignore after everything you've seen. Modern science isn't inventing new answers. It's rediscovering old ones. Olive oil for inflammation. Honey for infection. Lentils for longevity. Garlic for immunity. Fish for the brain. Herbs for healing. These aren't trends, they're patterns that have stood the test of time. But only when they're real. Not stripped down. Not overprocessed. Not turned into something unrecognizable. Because the difference between something that heals, and something that just tastes similar, is often everything. So now it comes down to a simple choice. Keep eating the modern versions that look the same on the surface. Or go back to the versions that actually made a difference. And maybe the most important question isn't which of these foods is the most powerful. It's which ones you're going to start using first.